So welcome everyone to our Childhood Neurodiversity workshop this evening on how the brain develops. My name's Dr. Annie Bryant. I am a clinical psychologist working in the Psychology in Schools team in Suffolk, which is part of the Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust, which is our local mental health trust. And I'm joined by my colleague Emily.
Hiya, my name is Emily Misen. I'm an assistant psychologist. I work alongside Annie in the Psychology in Schools team and the Under 18 Wellbeing team.
Thanks, Emily. So, what are we going to cover today? So today we are going to talk through child brain development. We're going to go through how the brain typically develops through different stages of childhood. We'll talk specifically about adolescence and the sort of unique and exciting changes in teenagers' brains. We'll then consider some different factors that can impact on development and who we are, including temperament and attachment and early life stress. Then we'll consider how you can support your child's development with a focus on relationships. And then, as always, at the end, we will provide some resources and further reading if you're interested. And we will have a survey to fill out at the end if you would like. So as we say with our other workshops, if there's any of the topics today that feel difficult or emotional for you to think about, please do take a break if you need to. This workshop is being recorded, so if you'd like to come back to it another time or you'd like to take a break and watch the recording, then you are more than welcome to. I can see somebody's got their hand raised. Unfortunately, we aren't able to respond to raised hands because we can't see you or hear you today. So we wanted to start by talking about neurodivergent brain development. So although we are going to be discussing typical brain development stages in a second, we want to recognise first that every child is unique. And for neurodivergent children, some expected skills or abilities or milestones may not develop on time or at all. So we really want to recognise that first. And also, your neurodivergent child may have unique abilities or skills that other children their age might not develop or might not be so skilled at. So we want to recognise that neurodivergence can challenge families' expectations of childhood development, of those milestones or what they see their child's childhood looking like. So we're going to start with a Slido here of how have your expectations of your child's development changed over time. Might be something that perhaps you were expecting to see that you didn't see. There might have been struggles, but you also might have noticed some strength or resilience in your child that maybe you didn't expect. Might be that perhaps it's not your expectations, but the expectations of others that have influenced or challenged your family. And if people have just joined us, if you'd like to take part in Slido, please do join us at slido.com with the code on the screen. Your responses are anonymous, but please don't feel you have to take part if you don't feel comfortable. Okay, so we've got delays due to autism. Yeah, developmental health challenges. I've accepted the way things are, not the way I or others think things should be. Yeah, that's really lovely. Very surprised when he started saying a couple of words and then stopped. Yeah, so that's really difficult. So a particular skill or ability developing and then regressing again is really challenging. Both delays and advancements due to autism. Yeah, really good point. Yeah. Expected to hit development milestones later than expected, but didn't notice it at first, noticing it more now. Yeah, that's quite common. So noticing the emotional side of things more. 4 children I've raised and they're all different. These are really lovely. Thank you, everyone. Really challenging and hard. Yeah, absolutely. Moving at my child's pace. I think that's a really nice phrase. Accepting her just as you are, but it has taken time. Yeah. And then we've got some specific things. So not recognizing familiar faces, emotional delays. Yeah. So we've got some keywords coming up at the top there that Slido works out for us. So we've got themes around delays, autism, challenges, expectations, school, delays due to hyperactivity, but has developed emotionally and so kind. That's lovely. Yeah. So some delays, but also some strengths. Due to stress, his behavior has changed. Yeah. So other external things impacting on changes. Learning not to say actual age, that's a really, really nice example. Yeah, so adjusting those expectations of age and what that means, having more patience. That's lovely. Thank you, everyone. That's really, really helpful, and hopefully helpful for you to see the experiences of some other families as well. So I'm going to hand over to Emily here, who's going to take us through some stages of child development.
Thanks, Annie. Okay, yeah, so we're going to start by thinking a little bit about babies, essentially. So babies are born with billions of brain cells, but mostly they're not really connected together. And these connections are developed and they strengthen firstly over time, but also with repeated experiences. So the more we do something, the more we're strengthening those connections between brain cells. So babies are born with lots of abilities, including they can hear the world around them. They particularly often will recognize their mother's voice. They'll enjoy looking at faces. They'll have those reflexes. So if if they feel like they're falling or something, they will naturally hold their hands out. There's lots of things reflexes that babies have from a very young age. The ability to sleep, obviously. And they're born ready to learn from you and from the world around them. And they do that at a really astonishing rate. So what can impact on that kind of prenatal brain development? So some things that might impact on it can be genetic conditions, which might affect how the brain and the body develop. Development can be impacted by substance use, such as alcohol, smoking, drug use, and things in pregnancy. Also poor diet, infectious diseases, stress, trauma. So lots of things even before your baby is born that can be impacting its brain development. Okay, so moving on to think about between 0 and 3 years old. So this is the period of time when there is quicker brain development than any other time in someone's life. So all of those networks between the brain cells are all really developing at a really fast rate at this point. So we've just broken them down, and we're doing this for kind of each age group, I guess, into different areas. So thinking first about sensory pathways. So this 0 to 3 is a really critical time for rapid development of the sensory systems. So being able to see and hear, understand touch and taste and smell. I'm sure you've all experienced babies putting everything in their mouth at this sort of baby infant stage. And over time, they'll develop sort of those motor skills like sitting up, crawling, walking, running, throwing, jumping, climbing. So that's all in what we'd consider these kind of sensory pathways. Then thinking about the language and literacy skills, they're learning from people around them. So first of all, they'll be babbling, and babies babble with each other, don't they? And then when it gets later, they'll start singing, they'll start reading, maybe these back and forth games to practice conversation. They might be kind of handing things back and forth between them. So all of these kind of things that you often see in young children. Developing confidence and independence. So this is obviously the time of life when you're most dependent on the trusted adults around them to keep them safe and to meet their needs, because there are significant limits to what they can do at this age. But they will be testing out things, exploring things on their own, in that knowledge and that comfort that you're there for them if something goes wrong. So when they crawl away to check something out, you'll be waiting for them, and you'll be that safe sort of home person that they can come back to if they need you. And they'll see how happy you are and how excited when they learn something new, and when they find that ball that's rolled behind the chair that they didn't know was there, because when babies are very young, if they can't see things, they just don't exist to them. And seeing your reaction will make them want to explore more and more. And it's slowly teaching them gradually that it's safe to try things on their own, which is a really important life skill that will develop more and more as they get older. Now, problem solving and self-control. So at this stage, they're starting to develop thinking skills. So they might understand size and shape. So how to stack blocks or do a puzzle, or those shape sorters. And they're also discovering cause and effect. So if I drop this, then it will fall to the ground, or, all of these kind of basic lessons that we might not really think about, but as a baby, it's a big discovery. And learning how to navigate the world and solve simple problems. And self-control, they're starting to learn from about the world, the rules of the world. So being taught what's dangerous and what's okay and what's not okay. And a lot of that will come from you as parents. And they're also starting to learn to control their impulses. But this is really difficult at this stage because we're going to talk on the next slide about brain development a little bit, but the part of their brain that is responsible for that is in very early development. So there's very little self-control at this age, and it's difficult to concentrate and pay attention. So on average, your attention span is about 2 to 3 times your age, so in minutes. Then in terms of their social and emotional development, they're learning about their emotions and the things that they're experiencing, the feelings that they're experiencing from others around them. So like they might learn from being fed, when they're hungry, to understand that that's what that feeling inside them is when they're hungry, that's hunger. They might be learning from others telling them what emotion they might be feeling to make sense of those experiences that they're having, and learning what they like and what they don't like. And they'll go from enjoying just kind of smiling and babbling with a parent to starting to develop these, enjoying playing with other children, possibly starting to be taught concepts like sharing and things and comforting others, and also using their imagination. They'll often start to be very imaginative at this stage and starting to play make-believe, making up stories, imaginary roles, all that kind of thing. So if we go on to look at the, okay, so this is the brain house. So this is the model of kind of brain development that I mentioned. So this was developed by an American psychologist called Dr. Dan Siegel. And he's done some really amazing work, which is really accessible and really great at helping us to understand what is happening in young people's brains. If you've attended any of our previous workshops, you might be familiar with this because we do talk about it quite often because it is a really useful model. So essentially, we can think about our brain as as a house, and it's got an upstairs part and a downstairs part. So the upstairs part is like the control tower. So it's this really amazing part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that allows us to do all these skills as adults, like problem solving, reasoning, thinking, and also regulating and engaging with our emotions and feeling that we've got some sense of control over those. So that's all in that upstairs part of the brain. Now, in the downstairs part of our brain, that's our emotion center. So that's our alarm system. So that's got the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is part of that emotion system. And its main responsibility of that downstairs brain is keeping us safe from danger. So it's responsible for triggering the fight, flight, freeze response when we think that we're unsafe or at risk from something, to keep us safe from danger. And we need that to keep us safe if there's a real danger, to motivate our bodies into action so that we're actually doing something and not just standing there. So if the amygdala detects a danger, it will trigger the fight, flight, freeze response, which will then make us respond. Now, that upstairs thinking part of the brain takes much longer to develop than the downstairs brain. So the upstairs brain is not fully developed until the age of about 25. And that's compared to that downstairs brain, which is developed really very, very young. So when babies and toddlers are having tantrums, they've really got very little control over their emotions because that part of their brain isn't developed yet. And that's something that you'll see throughout childhood and that we will come back to when we're talking about other stages. So you'll get tantrums, you'll get crying over little things, and also difficulty calming down when they've been upset. So that's all things that downstairs brain is doing. And when they're little, they've really got very little access to that upstairs brain. Okay, so moving on to 3 to 8 years. And I think there were quite a lot of you here with children in this sort of age group. So at this stage, the motor development is really kind of coming on a lot. So their balance is normally a lot better by this sort of age. They might be dancing, they might be doing sports. They'll often start to be dressing themselves, learning to use cutlery and all those kind of fine motor skills, scissors, paints. They might, if you're really lucky, be helping you with cooking and things. So all of those motor skills are kind of developing. In terms of language and literacy, Obviously at school, they're learning to increase their literacy. They might be learning the alphabet, spelling, writing. They might be reading, they might be telling stories, and that kind of sense of humor is developing. They might be singing. It's a really critical period. If you want your child to learn a language, this is the best time to really work on that, because that gets much harder after sort of 7 or 8. Whereas if you're in this kind of younger thing, you will learn languages much quicker. In terms of confidence and independence, they're starting to develop their independence. They're away from you more a lot of the time, particularly obviously with starting school and things. They might be away from you for quite extended periods of time, but even when they're kind of near you, they might be exploring more on their own and wanting to spend more time with other children and with their friends and less with family. And in terms of problem solving, these skills are gradually starting to increase. So at school, they're learning about maths and about science and about how things work, but they also might be learning things about how to plan things. So planning a game or planning a project and organising themselves. But if we're remembering that attention span is 2 to 3 times your age, it's still pretty short. Really, when we think that we expect children often to sit down and concentrate for quite long periods of time, you can see why that might be difficult. And in that social and emotional development, they're using their imagination a lot more. So lots of children are really quite imaginative by this sort of stage. They might be developing stories. They might be playing make-believe games with others or with toys. Some children have imaginary friends or an imaginary world that they like to go to. And their emotional development, their downstairs brain system is very good by this point at detecting danger. So that's quite effective by now. They're quite good at recognizing danger. The upstairs thinking brain is starting to get a little bit more control, but it's still got a really long way to go when you consider that we said that's not developed until about 25. So we'll still see a lack of emotional control compared to older children and adults. But they are starting to develop some understanding of their own emotions and the emotions of others. And they might be starting to develop a bit of empathy at this stage. Okay, now 8 to 12 years. So the motor skills by now are getting pretty good generally. So swimming, sports, they're normally fairly aware of their body. Handwriting often will improve quite a lot at this age. And they're much better at using tools and things, so arts and craft things, fixing things. In language and literacy, they're developing those writing skills, and they might be writing books or stories or things like that. And they are getting much more independent by this stage. So, and they get this kind of growing sense of responsibility. So maybe they've got jobs to do around the house. They're probably starting to get homework at school, and they might have some responsibility for getting themselves ready in the morning. The problem solving and self-control, that attention span is growing, but obviously it's still limited compared to adulthood. Again, those problem-solving skills are improving. They're starting to consider different possibilities, and they're starting to think more logically and getting better at kind of organising, and they might be working on projects and homework independently. They might understand being able to tell the time, things like that at this sort of age. And their social and emotional development. Friends and peers are becoming increasingly important by this stage, and there's often an element of peer pressure from wanting to fit in and be liked, which doesn't happen as much in younger children. Puberty is obviously approaching, and they might be becoming more aware of their body and maybe starting to feel some of those hormonal changes and the more intense emotions that come with puberty. Okay, so adolescence. The first thing, when we talk about adolescence today, we're talking about adolescence going from beyond the teenage years. So we're talking from age sort of 12 up to about 25 when our brain is fully developed. So that upstairs thinking brain is not going to be fully developed until we're about 25. And that's the part that is responsible for logic and planning and organization and emotion control. So just remember that right through our teens and early 20s, right into our mid 20s, that's still developing. So Dan Siegel again, he says that teenagers have more courage to try new things and they think in more ways that lead to more creativity. There's lots of connections being made and lost in the brain during adolescence. So that kind of use it or lose it thing, the more we practice a particular thing, the more it will be strengthening those connections in the brain that we talked about earlier. So that repetition will really make a difference. And as well as the brain development, obviously there's a lot of physical changes at this stage during puberty, which can be really tricky. Particularly some neurodivergent young people can find these physical changes in puberty really confusing or often quite distressing, and might need some support kind of with understanding what's happening to their bodies, because it can feel quite alien to them. So this is Dan Siegel's model about what happens in the adolescent brain change. So it's essence, which stands for emotional spark, which is these really intense emotions that we often experience during adolescence. So you'll notice teenagers are often quite impulsive, quite moody, quite reactive, and also very sensitive to negative feedback. But also they can find life really exciting and be really filled with energy and passion for life. Then social engagement is the next thing. So at this age, peer social status and acceptance matters more than ever. So they're much more interested in adolescence by what their peers think than by what we think as adults. That peer connectedness is really, really important to them. And it gives the possibility of developing new friendships and developing their social skills, but it also means that they can be really, really hypersensitive to social exclusion, and avoiding that risk of exclusion or embarrassment in front of peers can matter more than avoiding other types of risk. So that will lead to the kind of risk behaviours that we often see in adolescence. And linked to that is this sense of novelty. So sensation seeking and risk taking that overemphasizes or downplays risk is really key at this age. So they'll often be more impulsive, so they'll be acting before they're thinking, and they need more novelty to get the same feel-good sort of dopamine hit that we would get as an adult for a risky thing. But the positives of that, again, they can develop new interests often. There's often new opportunities, sense of adventure and fun, and they'll often be more open to change and really enjoying what life has got to offer. And then finally, creative exploration. So at this stage, they're really starting to think on a different level, kind of conceptually, and their abstract reasoning will allow for more out-of-the-box thinking. So sometimes teenagers will say things and you'll just be thinking, wait, where on earth did that come from? I would never have thought of that. And that's to do with this kind of out-of-the-box thinking. And having new ideas, seeing the world through a new and exciting lens, but also that kind of searching for meaning of life and being very curious can also lead to this kind of crisis of identity. And again, that vulnerability to peer pressure and lack of direction or purpose. So there's lots of real strengths in adolescence, but also a lot of things that can be really tricky to manage. Okay, yeah, so moving on, I know a lot of you have got younger children, but we're just curious, for those of you who have got adolescents, what are some of the areas that you've seen in your adolescent that you feel concerned about or that create challenges for you or your family? Lack of organisation skills, yeah, absolutely. And high level of anxiety, moodiness, switches mood really suddenly, yeah, absolutely. And if you think about what we've talked about, that really makes sense. More organisation, diminishing confidence and independence, okay. Lots of impulsivity and lack of consequences, lots of mood swings. a lack of awareness about the impact of their behavior on others. Yeah, absolutely. And that's common in lots of adolescents. But I think particularly with kind of neurodivergence, that's adding another layer on lots of these things, isn't it? Misunderstanding things and then gets angry about it. Yeah, absolutely. Lack of motivation, wanting to be left alone. Yeah, depression, unable to cope at school. Anxiety holding him back and discouraging him from trying new experiences. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes there's some of that peer, that fear of kind of standing out from peers and things that can play into that as well. Lots of people talking about bullying and wanting to be in their room all the time and struggling with social skills. Absolutely, which is really difficult. And that emotion regulation, yeah, absolutely. So Slido's decided to give us a couple of things at the top now. So mood and peers. And I think that really just sums up adolescence, doesn't it? Mood and peers. Okay, academic struggles. Yeah, absolutely. Lack of sleep. Shutting himself away and not talking. Yeah, so these are all things that, you know, are absolutely, if you think about what we've just talked about, it's all really understandable and it's all very consistent with what you would expect to be difficult at this stage. But that doesn't make it any easier necessarily for you as a parent managing it at that time. Okay, so just a quick slide to think about neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity refers to the brain's capacity to change, essentially. And throughout childhood, right up to the age of 25, the brain is changing. But we do have the ability to influence those changes. So by the experiences that we're providing, all of these things that we've talked about can provide some influence over the changes in the brain. Now, even as an adult, it is possible for your brain to continue to change, but that capacity for change does decrease with age. So it is still flexible to learning and specializing even in adulthood, but it's much less pliable. So if you think of a bit of plasticine, and when they get really old, it gets harder and it's harder to squidge, isn't it? So that's essentially a bit what our brain is like. It doesn't go completely rock hard, but it's more difficult. And what fires together wires together. So the more that we're doing together, the more it's going to become embedded. Okay. Right, I think back to you, Annie.
Thanks, Emily. So we're going to move on to think about some different things that can impact on children's development and kind of what makes us unique, what makes people different and what makes people unique. And the first thing that we're going to start with is temperament. So what I mean by temperament is our kind of inherent nature, our character. So children and adults, we all have innate differences in the way that we are, the way that we respond to the world and the way that we think and that we feel. So I'm going to talk through some different sort of temperament traits, and these different traits came from a really long-term study many years ago in New York, and they studied a kind of large population of children at regular intervals over a really long time, and they identified these temperament traits or kind of character traits that were present in the children from birth and throughout their lives. So no matter what happened, they had these inherent traits and they were able to define them in these different areas, and I'll go through each one. And it's important to recognize that with temperament, none of these different aspects of temperament are right or wrong. None of them are better or worse than each other. It's just about how we are all different. So the first one is activity level. So this one is about how much natural energy a child has. So having too little energy or being a bit more sedentary can make it harder for a child to maybe complete a task. But on the other hand, a child with too much energy might be a bit harder to control or a bit harder to concentrate or focus on things. Regularity is about kind of predictability and whether a child prefers predictability and routine or whether they are kind of have a preference for more variation and difference. And this also refers to a child's natural patterns of regularity, so kind of regularity of their eating and their sleep and some of those more biological functions. Approach and withdrawal is an interesting one. That is about a child's initial reaction to situations. So, for example, when a child faces a new experience, such as a new person, a new environment, a new toy, some children will accept that and embrace it really quickly and really get stuck in, whereas some other children might be a bit more withdrawn and a bit more hesitant. Adaptability, that's about how accommodating or how resistant a child might be to changes. So when something in the environment changes, some children adapt really quickly. They embrace the new change and they crack on and get on with it. Whereas some children really struggle when things change, and lots of neurodivergent children really struggle when things change. So whether that's a new rule or a new school or a new house, some children can find that really difficult. But actually, for children who really kind of embrace change, they may be much more influenced by their environment, and that can have negative sides to it as well. Intensity is about how kind of exuberant a child is and how much they respond emotionally to things. So some children might be much more exuberant and emotional, and some children might be much more lethargic and kind of low-key in their emotions. So a really exuberant child, if a sad event happens, they might cry lots and lots. And when something funny happens, they might laugh loads and get really, really hysterical. But on the flip side, having too big of an emotional response can make it quite difficult for other people to help support that child. And a child with kind of fewer or more muted emotional responses might be more challenging for other people to read, but they also might be more resilient in certain situations. Similarly, there's a kind of aspect of mood. So whether a child is more naturally positive or negative in mood. So some children are naturally really upbeat, in a good mood, positive. But too much positivity can make it difficult for other people to know when a child's in distress or for them to know when they need to ask for help. And then a child with a tendency towards a negative mood can also be quite hard to read and might struggle with their emotions. Distractibility, so lots of people were talking about kind of distractibility and concentration. So this is whether a child can be quite attentive and on task, or whether they're easily distracted and sidetracked. So children who are really easily distracted, they can be really great at observing the world around them, at being spontaneous and noticing new things and getting involved in exciting things. But they can understandably really struggle to stay on task, and that can make things like classwork really difficult. And then for children who are quite attentive and can really pay attention, they might be able to do really well in, say, a classroom activity, but they might not be so aware of the things that are going on around them, and they might not react in time to changes. Persistence is another interesting one. So this is similarly about attention. So whether a child gets really, really immersed and persistent about something, or whether they're a bit more disinterested and relaxed about stuff. So persistent children can usually finish a task, even if it's frustrating or even if they don't like it very much. So if perhaps they're doing homework and they come across a problem, they might be more likely to just become a child who is less persistent, for example, they might be more likely to become a bit annoyed and quit. So if a child is disinterested, they might quit at the first sign of trouble. But on the flip side, too much persistence and engagement in something can mean that a child doesn't realise when they're in over their head and they need help. And then finally, sensory threshold. And this is something that we're going to have another workshop on at another time. So this is about kind of how a child responds to sensory stimuli. So whether they're not particularly affected by sensory things, so touch, brightness, noise, smells, tastes. But some children are really, really sensitive to sensory stimuli and can find it really distressing when there's a lot of stimuli around. Similarly, that can mean that they're very good at noticing changes in stimuli, so noticing changes in smells or tastes and things like that. So what different temperament traits do you notice in your family? So again, remember, there's no good or bad traits, no right or wrong, we're all just different. So this could be traits that you notice in your children, in yourselves, in your siblings, parents. What different sort of traits do you notice? Easily distracted, yeah. Patience. Intense emotions, moods, yeah. Giving up easily, hyper, yeah. Every family member has different traits. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So we are all different. Even within the same family, you can get really different temperaments. A bottle of pop. So that sounds like a kind of emotionally explosive, sensory sensitive there, lack of confidence, hyper or hypo focus. Yeah. Yeah. Resilient and optimistic. Yeah, they're really nice. Anger. So lots relating to mood and kind of emotions and intensity, lack of concentration, averse to changes. Yeah. Curious. Okay. Yeah. Strong emotions, focuses for a long time, then changes to something else. Yeah. So we've got differences in focus and attention and mood. 3 children with very varying traits. Yeah, absolutely. Really challenging. Hates unplanned events. Yeah. So really not very adaptable, really liking consistency. My son will always be aware of the environment, not focusing on the task. And I am intense. Yeah. If something needs to change, questioning everything, blames himself, wants to be home and then wants not to be home. Absolutely, yeah. Okay. So loads of different traits going on here, and I'm sure you'll be thinking about lots of different members of your family and how you might all be different. Thank you, everyone. That's really, really helpful. We've got lots of themes coming up there around sensory, anger, intensity, meltdowns, distraction. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. So another aspect of life that can impact on our development is attachment. You may well have heard this word before, but attachment really is about that relationship between parent and child, or child and caregiver. And really what we want to emphasize here is that early relationships shape our future relationships. So our experiences of relationships in our early childhood create a blueprint or a template for how we experience and behave in relationships when we get older, whether that's relationships with friends, colleagues, romantic partners, just acquaintances. What we learn as infants and as toddlers and young children is we learn how we can expect to be treated by other people. And we learn what it means to be connected to somebody or to be in some sort of relationship with somebody. And ideally, in early childhood, there'd be a situation similar to what Emily was explaining earlier, where children learn that they are safe and supported with their parent or their carer or their family, creating a safe base for them to feel confident enough to try going out in the world on their own, to try experiencing something and coming back to that safe base, either for support when things go wrong or to share the enjoyment and excitement of whatever they've found with that loved person. And this pattern of considering the parent or carer as a safe base and a source of comfort and support allows that child to grow up to have friendships and relationships that provide them with support and comfort and enjoyment, whilst also being able to be independent and have a sense of self. So what can make attachment different or difficult? So neurodivergent children may struggle to attach to their caregivers in typical or kind of expected ways. So one aspect could be that a neurodivergent child might struggle with closely attaching to a parent. They may not be very easily comforted. They may not respond to those kind of caring emotions and behaviours of their parent in expected ways. They may not develop that sense of safety or particularly share excitement and joy of things that they find with their parent. And that can be really challenging for parents. Could also be the opposite of a much more intense and closely intertwined relationship between parent and child due to a high level of dependency for children with additional needs. So a neurodivergent child might really struggle with stepping away from that safe base of their parent due to finding the world really overwhelming or too challenging. Or perhaps they just genuinely need much more practical support with daily living from their parent than compared to other children their age who might be a bit more independent. And then also stressful life experiences can disrupt attachment between parent and child. And this can be unavoidable, kind of really unfortunate situations. For example, if a parent is unfortunately in hospital, unwell at some time during the child's early life, can be the impact of things like domestic violence or living in poverty, putting families under really extreme pressure. And of course, that's going to have an impact on relationships. So if you feel comfortable to, we wanted to ask, what has your experience been like of attachment with your neurodivergent child or children? Whether that's positive, negative, struggles, anything that was surprising or different for you. And again, if this feels really tricky for you and you want to take a break and come back to it, please do. That's absolutely fine. So we've got an intense attachment, very attached to mum and struggles with dad. Yeah, that's really tricky. We hear that a lot, actually, that a child attaches particularly to one child. Okay, intense attachment, very different to the other children where that attachment feels enough. Okay, using you as a security blanket. Yeah, that's a really, really good example. Higher level of, so we've got quite a lot of kind of higher level of attachment to one parent or the other. No attachment. Okay, yeah, wow, that's really, really difficult. Doesn't find the same comfort from different parents, very attached, but won't show affection to other people. Yeah, and hard to connect with siblings. Okay, so got a close attachment with parent and less with siblings. A foster child, so needs lots of reassurance, absolutely. Yeah, separation anxiety. So that anxiety when your child's away from you and they haven't got that close attachment near them. Having a child that wouldn't go to anyone but myself, so intense I couldn't put her down. Yeah. And how exhausting, how exhausting that must be. Won't allow me to comfort. Yeah. Increasing attachment and decreasing independence. And a nice comment there of, I understand him the most. So there is something really, really protective and wonderful about that attachment. It might be a very intense or at times challenging attachment, but you know your children best and you can be their champion. Very upset when I'm upset. Yeah, so really responsive to your emotions. Doesn't like going to sleep alone. Yeah. Oh, thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. So loads of varied experiences here. Needs a lot of support at bedtimes. Yeah, bedtimes are really difficult. There's that separation at bedtime, isn't there? That can be really challenging. Thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. So we're going to think briefly about the possible impact of early life stress on childhood brain development. And we're not going to spend too long on this because we will have a whole workshop on early life stress and trauma in a couple of months' time. But early life stress or traumatic experiences can impact on a child's brain development, depending on what stage of development their brain is in when they experience the stressful event. So this diagram here kind of goes chronologically from earliest development down, and I'll go through each one thinking about what changes we might see. So at the top of the diagram, we've got the earliest part of the brain to develop in a baby, which is the brainstem. So that provides the essential functions for life. So setting up our sensory systems, controlling automatic functions like our hearts beating and breathing. So early life stress at this early developmental stage, when the brain is really, really in its early stages of development, that can impact on a child experiencing sensory processing difficulties with arousal, impulsivity, maybe impaired sleep, and maybe unexplained medical symptoms. The next to develop, as Emily said, is that downstairs brain, that emotional alarm system that kicks off our fight or flight response when it sees danger. So early life stress or trauma at this stage of brain development can result in attachment difficulties with heightened emotions, aggression, and dysregulation of emotions and of behaviour. And then that last stage to develop, the one we've said keeps developing till we're 25, that upstairs thinking brain, the most complex, clever parts of our brain. When our kind of lower down parts of our brain are fairly developed, but we're at this stage of upstairs thinking brain developing, if we experience life stress at this point or trauma, we might see that impacting on problem-solving difficulties, maybe difficulties with memory, self-esteem, information processing. So as you may have noticed from that previous slide, there can be a really significant overlap between symptoms or traits and behaviours of early life stress impacts and innate neurodivergent symptoms. And it can be really difficult to disentangle these symptoms or behaviours to make sense of where they might be coming from. And some of you might be aware of this if you've been through, for example, an assessment for a neurodivergent condition, and whether that's for yourself or for your child. You will likely have been asked about any early life stress or trauma as part of that assessment. And that's because the clinician is trying to work out where some of those traits and behaviours might have come from. It may also be that professional services or clinicians have recommended support for early life stress or family support or trauma to see what challenges remain afterwards before they would consider a child for a neurodevelopmental assessment. And hopefully what this diagram also shows is that some children can be both neurodivergent and have suffered early life stress. There can be a big overlap in the middle. So these two things are not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. And as I said, we will have a workshop focusing specifically on early life stress later on. So I'm going to hand back to Emily now, who's going to talk us through ways that you can support your child's brain development.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, so we're going to talk about supporting brain development, and we're going to do it in kind of 4 main sections. So we'll start just by thinking a little bit about the importance of relationships. Then we'll move on to something we call mentalizing, which I'll explain more when we get to. Then we're going to talk about something called a growth mindset. And then we've got some slides on thinking about supporting teenagers, because we were very mindful when we were creating this about the challenges of being a neurodivergent teenager, essentially. So we've got some slides specifically on that. Okay, so as we've said right from the start, even from when you've got newborn babies, children and teenagers are learning and their brains are developing based on the experiences they have with others around them. And relationships are really the key to brain development for children. And by that, we don't just mean parents, we mean all of those of us who have relationships with children, whether that's the parents, carers, teachers, clinicians, your family, friends, anyone who has these relationships with children. And it's just so key that they have relationships that they can learn from, that they can develop through. Because that's how our brains are developing the whole time. So that's just really the first thing that we wanted to highlight, just the importance of these relationships in terms of supporting your child's brain development. And sometimes different people are good at supporting different things. And as we've talked about, all the different really broad areas of brain development. And you might have some people who are really great at supporting that kind of motor development, for instance, but maybe don't come to me for football help. Like, that's not going to end well. So yeah, just thinking about relationships and who can mean what to your child, and who can support your child with what. Okay, so mentalizing. Now this is a definition that I'll read you, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what mentalizing does and how we go about doing it. So what mentalizing is, the definition is the imaginative activity of making sense of the actions of oneself and others on the basis of intentional mental states such as desires, feelings, and beliefs. So mentalizing is what we do when we're imagining what might be going on in the mind of someone underneath the behavior that we see on the outside. Now, this can be something that can be really tricky for autistic people in particular, because it requires you to be able to put yourself into someone else's shoes, essentially, and think what might be happening for them, which can be really tricky. We mention this specifically partly because it might be difficult if you've got children who are autistic. They might really struggle with this, and they might really struggle to understand why a peer might be reacting in the way that they are or something. But also we know that neurodivergence often has, that there's a strong genetic component to it. And so also if you're autistic, you might find this tricky. And so it might then be something that you struggle a little bit to support your child with. So what can mentalizing do? What is the point of it? So there's 4 key things. So firstly, it can help your child to develop emotional literacy. So that's something that we know can be really tricky for young people who are neurodivergent, to kind of understand their emotions and understand the emotions of others, and why people might be acting in the way that they are. So the first thing we would say is that mentalizing can be really helpful for teaching some of those emotional literacy skills. The second thing is about helping your child develop social skills. So again, it's the more your child has an understanding of other people, the more that's likely to impact their social skills. And as we know, social skills, again, and lots of you have talked about that being something that's quite tricky for your child. So again, this can be really helpful for supporting that social skills development. It can also be helpful for problem solving. So sometimes we might come up against a problem, and actually if we've got a better understanding of what's going on for us or someone else, then that can help us to kind of think through what we might need to do next, and to make those kind of decisions relating to problem solving. And the last thing is that it can help you and others to understand your child, and it can also help them to understand themselves better as well. So really increasing that understanding, I guess, for you to understand them, but also for them to understand you, and for them to understand other people. So we've talked about why it's so great. How do you actually do it? So mentalizing in action. So these are just some examples of things that we would call mentalizing. Now, we do appreciate it's a bit of a fancy term for something that you might read this and think, well, this is really obvious. And in some ways it is, but it's also something that people don't necessarily always do that often, which is why we're talking about it. So if you were trying to mentalize yourself for your child, you might say, oh, I'm feeling tired today, which is why I'm a bit grumpy. Or I'm feeling quite overwhelmed by all the noise. I think I need a bit of quiet time. Or I'm feeling a bit nervous about a presentation I'm doing tomorrow at work. So I guess you're naming those emotions and kind of explaining how that might be impacting your behavior, or what you're doing, or how you're feeling and things. So these are some examples of how you might be able to mentalize your child. So you didn't sleep well last night, so you're tired, which I think is why you're finding it hard to concentrate. I wonder if you're feeling worried about going out later. And saying I wonder rather than putting it as a statement can be a really good way of kind of testing it out with them. And also, I think sometimes, particularly with teenagers, if you say, oh, I think you're worried, that can get their defenses up. Whereas actually, I'm just wondering if you're worried, or I'm just a bit curious about this. That's something that we do as mental health professionals a lot. We often say that we're curious or we're wondering about things. It's kind of less confrontational. Another example might be saying, oh, that sounds like it's been a really overwhelming day for you at school. Maybe do you think you need some time to calm down before we do anything else? So again, just recognizing what might be going on for them and what they might need in that moment. And then also mentalizing others for your child. So this is what can be particularly helpful with developing the sort of emotional literacy things. So it sounds like the teacher didn't understand what happened, which is maybe why they reacted in a surprising way. Or when your friend said they don't want to go out and play, I wonder if that's because they're tired, not because they don't like you. Or that character in the film seems lonely because no one's talking to them, so maybe that's why they're upset. So you can really see it's a really clear way of just kind of, I guess, helping your child to understand that what they're seeing. So someone saying that they don't want to go out and play might not be about not liking them, which might be their first thought. It's about kind of exploring some of those underneath things, and it's a really valuable skill that if you can support your child to do this, is likely to be helpful for them kind of throughout life, really, I guess, particularly if it's something that they don't do that naturally. Okay, so we've just got a little video on growth mindset, if it's going to play.
I will try. I will press play. Let me know if you can't hear it, Emily.
Okay.
There are 2 types of mindset we can cultivate. One that embraces problems as opportunities to learn, and one that avoids them, often out of fear to fail. People that avoid conflicts can be described as having a fixed mindset. Those who see problems as interesting challenges have a growth mindset. Sometimes we like to switch from one to the other. People have a fixed mindset because they believe that basic qualities like intelligence or talents are fixed traits, and that these traits are responsible for success. They often like to document past achievements. With a growth mindset, people believe that new abilities can be developed through practice. This view creates the love for learning that most great leaders and artists have in common. For them, life becomes an exciting journey with endless opportunity to figure out new things and advance. To develop a growth mindset, Dr. Carol Dweck, the Stanford University professor who coined the term, advises leaders, teachers, and parents to celebrate trying. Teachers should applaud students for any grade if they studied hard. Parents should encourage their children to develop any new skill they are interested in. Doing this will make them learn the skill of learning, which will also help them back in the classroom. To illustrate the difference in everyday life.
Okay, thanks, Annie. So we're going to stop it there because we don't have time to show the whole video, but you will have the link to that if it is something you want to go on to watch, if it's something that you're interested in. And I think in the resources we've also added a link to a TED Talk about that. So this is really about the difference between growth and fixed mindset, and we would really encourage you to support your children to move towards a growth mindset for the reasons detailed in the video. And really it's about that complete change in, so if you've got the growth mindset, failure is an opportunity to grow, as opposed to being, oh, I failed because I'm rubbish at that and that's not something I can ever do. And I'm sure that this is something that you can probably recognize sometimes in your children, often that feeling of, oh, well, I'm no good at that, so I'm not going to try it. And probably in yourself as well. I know that I've had times when I've just thought, nope, no good at that, not even going to attempt that. But actually, if we can move more into the growth mindset and think in terms of challenges and learning and improving, there's lots and lots of benefits of that. And in terms of trying new things and opportunity for development and growth, I guess. And if you're an adult, for continuing to, that sort of brain development that we talked about earlier that slows down a bit when you're an adult, this is a way of kind of keeping it going by trying to learn things all the time and really kind of going with that growth and learning. So that's something else that we felt is really important and something that's really valuable that you can do to try to support your child. So really focusing on praising effort rather than achievement, and for encouraging trying things, even if you might not naturally be the best at it, because you'll get better. So all of that kind of thing is really valuable. So that's something else that we just felt like we wanted to talk about. Okay, so moving on to thinking about supporting neurodivergent teenagers. We do appreciate that a lot of you have got younger children, but hopefully this will be helpful for a little bit further down the line for you as well. So the first thing is that it's really important to accept that it's normal for relationships to change once your child reaches adolescence. And we talk about this kind of transition from being a manager to being a coach. So moving from being the person who's kind of controlling things and telling them what to do to supporting and encouraging. And even though that relationship's changing, connection still really matters. So having these kind of routines, rituals, things you do together, prioritizing hanging out and spending time together, sharing in things that are important to them, all of that kind of thing is still really important. in terms, striking while the iron is cold is something, so that's about picking the right time to have a difficult conversation. So avoid having those tricky conversations, and this doesn't just apply to adolescents, this is true for everyone. Avoiding having those tricky conversations when people are in a really reactive state. So if your child is already really upset and angry about something, that's probably not going to be a good time to sit down and have a conversation with them that you already know might be quite difficult. So it's much better to step away, give them time to calm down, possibly give you time to calm down if you've just had an argument or something. So just really picking those times for conversations. Okay, now I statements. So keep in mind what we've talked about with emotional literacy and not kind of jumping to assumptions, and also not kind of going into a confrontational thing. It's much better to say how you feel about what's happening rather than commenting on what they're doing. So I might say, Annie, I feel sad when you, I'm not going to say anything because Annie, you're not making me feel sad and I don't want to make you paranoid that you're doing something wrong, but you get the idea. Instead of saying, Annie, you do this and I really don't like it, if I say, oh, Annie, it makes me feel like this when this happens. So really thinking about framing things in terms of the impact it has on you as an individual rather than that thing that you're doing. So I statements are really important. And also be specific. So if someone is feeling low in mood, or if they're upset, or if they've got lots going on, or if they've just had a really bad day and they're feeling quite overwhelmed, all of those things make it really difficult to think clearly. And so if you're trying to identify a difficulty or something, it can be quite helpful to be quite specific about what you're thinking about, what the difficulty is, because otherwise there might be this tendency for it just to be, I'm sure you've may well have had this thing where someone says to you, or you say to someone, what's wrong? And you're just like, everything is wrong, it's all wrong, nothing, but actually that's not very helpful in terms of moving forward. So I'm thinking about what needs to change and what needs to happen. So either you being more specific if you're suggesting things, or just supporting your child to maybe be more specific about what it is that's bothering them. So you might say, I can hear that it feels like everything is really difficult right now, but I'm wondering, is there one thing in particular that is feeling more tricky than everything else that we could focus on to start with? So just encouraging that kind of, I guess, prioritizing of things in your mind. And also if you're wanting to support them with something that they might be struggling with, so for instance, we talk about this a lot with kind of adolescents might be kind of in quite a stuck thing, it might be sleep pattern, it might be whatever it is, but if you're wanting to kind of support with that, it can be really helpful to have a couple of solutions in mind first, so that it's not just you telling them what to do, but you might be able to give a few options of, well, we could try this, or what about giving this a go, or you might want to try this. So you're giving some choice, which feels again less confrontational, and gives them some control to think about what they might like to try. And again, that's something that applies to younger children as well. If you know that you've got to get them out the house by a certain time and they're dragging their heels, and you can give them choices instead of just, right, put this on, get out, that kind of thing. If you can give them, would you like to put on your shoes first, or would you like to get your coat first? It might only be a small thing, but you're giving them that element of choice. So multiple solutions to get to the same end point, I guess. And the last thing is about trying to put yourself in their shoes. So doing that mentalizing that we've just talked about, and trying to start with kind of positive, understanding statements. So showing that you want to understand how they feel. So I'm really hearing how important it is to you to go out and meet with your friends today, and how hard it is that I'm saying that you can't do that today. So that you're recognizing their emotions really, and kind of validating that is really valuable.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you. So we are nearing the end of our workshop today. We've got just over 5 minutes left, so we will go through some resources and then we will have a few sort of finishing questions at the end and a feedback survey if you'd like to take part in that. So we've got some ideas on the screen here for some resources around brain development and adolescence. You will get a copy of these slides with all the links, so don't worry about writing these all down. So we've got those two charities around the first sort of few years of life and the brain development on the left there. Fantastic book by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson about the whole brain child, about brain development. A longer TED talk about fixed and growth mindset, and then a great book by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You, which is about sort of childhood trauma and the impact on brain development. And then for adolescents, we've got a book by Sarah Jane Blakemore, a book by a lady called Dr. Camilla Pang called Perfectly Weird, Perfectly You. Dr. Pang is autistic herself, and she's written a book about her experiences growing up as an autistic teenager and using science to understand teenage development and embracing being neurodivergent as a teenager. There's some resources there about puberty and keeping healthy, designed for children with autism or learning disabilities. And Childline have a helpful website about puberty as well. The ADHD Foundation have a resource there about supporting teenagers with ADHD. And then there's a National Autistic Society programme called Teen Life, which is actually run nationally in lots of different locations. And it is run in Suffolk by Suffolk Family Carers in the East and Family Action in the West, which is for parents of autistic teenagers for some advice and support. So our upcoming workshops in this childhood neurodiversity programme, we have our next one on the 7th of September, which is about understanding and managing behaviour. We have that workshop on the impact of early life stress in October, and then we will have future workshops every month. We've got sensory processing, eating, communication, cognitive difficulties, sleep, technology and social relationships. And we also have termly workshops on mental health topics as well, which you sign up to in exactly the same way as you did for today on our Eventbrite page. So we've got ones coming up on supporting young people with anxiety for older children and for younger children around managing feelings and emotion regulation. We'll have one on low mood and one on self-harm. They're all coming up in the next sort of academic term. And then we've got lots of previous workshops, including one on the teenage brain. So if you do have a teenager and you would like to watch a workshop specifically about teenage brains, then have a look at that one. They are all on our YouTube page, and we've got some examples there of other topics that we've had. So just to finish off, so how would you rate your knowledge of brain development through childhood now? So do take part if you're still on the call. It's really helpful for us to know if you're finding this helpful, if we can improve in any way. So we'll have a couple of questions after this as well. I'm afraid we can't answer any questions because we can't see you or hear you. Brilliant. But I think when we started, we were around a 5 out of 10 of understanding, weren't we, Emily? So
yeah, I think the average that it was giving was a 4 point something. So we've gone up a bit.
Great.
So that's great.
Great. So hopefully, and we've got no one at the 1 or 2 end of 10 at the moment, which is really great. So hopefully most people here have found it helpful in terms of learning a bit more about brain development. Thank you, everyone. And then have you found this workshop helpful? So again, please do feel that you can be honest. It's helpful for us to know how this workshop is landing. This is the first time we've done this workshop and this series of workshops, and we really will develop the workshop programme based on your feedback. So do let us know what you think. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Brilliant. I'll just give people a little bit more time. Okay. Right, thank you. And then what 2 key things will you take away from this workshop? And we ask this question in all our workshops for 2 reasons, partly because it's helpful for us to know what we should keep in when we run these workshops again in future, but also we know that it is easier to remember things when you are asked to kind of summarize it or write down the things that you've found most helpful. So what are the key takeaways for you from today? Attention span 2 to 3 times your age. Yeah, that's a good fact. Yeah, breathing and taking things slower, mentalizing and attachment, mentalizing, growth mindset. Yeah, there's some really lovely materials about growth mindset out there. There's kind of books and videos and all kinds of things. I statements with adolescence. Yeah, mentalizing. There are other people dealing with similar things. Yeah, we do find it's really nice seeing everyone's comments and people getting to see other families' experiences. Taking deep breaths, the brain model. Brain not developed until 25. Yeah, absolutely. We think of teenagers as kind of up to the age of 19, but their brains are not fully developed until they're 25. The video was good, growth and mentalizing. Why my teenager has mood swings. Yeah, because it can feel really confusing. It can seem bizarre when teenagers change their mood almost immediately or in response to apparently nothing that we can necessarily understand on the surface. Better understanding of the brain, how different my children's brain work to others. Yeah, using I wonder, help me understand myself a bit. Yeah, absolutely. There's a few more people typing, so I will just let you finish. Peer acceptance. Yeah, it's absolutely essential to teenagers. It can come before all other aspects of life, even more important than risk. So teenagers are really, really sensitive to how their peers feel about them. Often limited choices to give control and more acknowledgement of genetic links. Yeah,